sensitizes me physically and mentally. My senses become more alert. Memories come out of hiding. Emotions stand at attention. Imagination goes on a binge. So I spent last night at the home place, partly because I like to be there, but mainly because I wanted the feel of it just before I read this paper. It's not far from here, just over the horizon to the west, barely out of sight. When you go on this building, look, if you will, just a little to the south of west. Then, in your imagination, strip away all the sights and sounds about you, lift off all but the largest vegetation, and lay down upon the land a sea of waist-high grass rolling steadily westward, wave upon wave. If your imagination is in good condition, and I hope it is, you will see what great-grandfather Cox and his family saw as they bumped along the vertebrae of the Devil's Backbone nearly a century and a quarter ago, heading west. Great-grandfather, his name was Josiah, had come from Crawford County, Arkansas, one of my family's stops on his way from God knows where to the place I left this morning to come here. Nobody ever told me why he stopped where he did, but a strong strain of Indian blood may have guided him, for the spot he chose was near a spring that had watered a series of Indian civilizations for thousands of years before he arrived. When great-grandfather got there, it had not been long since the last Indian of the last Indian civilization had left, packed up, vamoosed, bow, string, and arrow. For thousands of years, he and his ancestors had fed so snugly into the ecological niche that when they left, the only signs above the turf were some old lodge poles scattered around fire rings not yet grown over by grass. And when he left, those were all they left to show his millennia of residence. With him went the name of the pleasant little creek beside which he camped. With him went the name of the round top hill at whose base the creek arose. With him went the name of the shallow canyon into which it poured its waters. For the first time in 10,000 years, the tall bluffs that stand up between the river and the plateau to the east were without a name. When the Indian camped beside the creek, the place from which I came from this morning was his home place. The creek had a name, the hill had a name, the canyon had a name. Everything within his sight was identifiable by name, by memories attached to it, by legend about it, and history of it. As I feel this morning, he felt. As I remember this morning, he remembered. As I speak this morning, he spoke. For the natural repository of the history of the land is the people who live on it, and the natural preservative of that history is oral tradition. As the Indian was the last repository of the oral tradition of his old home place, I am the last repository of the oral tradition of mine. An oral tradition grows best in the generations that are too busy to waste time on writing. It grows fastest when man is most actively in conflict with his environment, and is preserved best when the family produces in its middle generations a storyteller such as my father, to bring together the history of the land and the stories of the people who have lived on it. By the time Papa was born in 1872, great-grandfather was dead, and the land on which he had built his cabin and planted his first crop was called the Old Place. Today, the distinguishing feature of the Old Place is the Cox Graveyard, an institution dedicated by the internment of great-grandfather's body 2 years after his arrival. Other than that graveyard, great-grandfather's legacy to family oral tradition was that which he had received from his parents, the vocabulary and speech patterns accumulated in the Middle South. As I stood this morning on the gallery at the home place and looked across at the graveyard waiting on me, I was reminded of some of the hand-me-downs from that legacy. The little creek had become the branch. It arose at the foot of Round Mountain, swept down between the old place and the home place, and poured into the cove. These place names, and others like them, were left to a widow, 3 daughters and 2 sons, who tutored the next generation of family idiom, and I, in turn, got my basic vocabulary from that generation. Got it so well that the language I'm using this morning is sprinkled with words passed down through old Josiah. Nor would my sons head for E. Bagby Atwood's Regional Vocabulary of Texas to find out what was wrong if I told them the backstick was on Anti-Goslin. Even though they were born in the flowback from the frontier, they know that milk that is blinky one day may be clabbered the next. They know that the cow that gave the milk will stand still if I say saw in a commanding tone, that she may bawl or low from where she grazes and draw, swag, or flap, and that she may bed down in a mott to chew her cud. And they know that if a woods colt were to come through the mott while she was there, it would have 2 legs, not 4. The heart of the home place is the house. Grandpa built it 95 years ago on the exact spot where the old house had been burned to the ground by unidentified but well-suspected arsonists during the troubles that followed the Civil War. It is a two-story, framed house of virgin pine and cypress, held together by square nails and wooden pegs, embraced east-west by finely cut stone chimneys. A long gallery, once banistered, faces south into a motte of live oaks that go back to Indian times, and a dog run divides the ground floor into two rooms, warmed by fireplaces in the winter and cooled in the summer by the prevailing south wind. The side of the house is a lesson in topographical discrimination. Laid out by signing the North Star on a clear night and squared with a hair rope, the house sits so exactly on the divide of a seemingly level glade that the rain which falls on the north side of the house drains towards the Blanco, and that which falls on the south side drains towards the branch. The grove of oak trees catches the south wind in its leaves and turns it downward towards the perpetual shade beneath, cooling the air before it sucked across the porch and into the house by the dog run. To the east of the house were corn cribs, and to the north of them were the hog pens, the cow pen, and the horse lot. These normal adjuncts to the frontier farming and ranching enterprise were built to the north in natural divide, so the drainage from them would be toward the Blanco, half a mile away, rather than towards the branch, the source of the domestic water supply. The house has legal metes and bounds, which describe by words that strike the ear pleasantly. Words such as, for instance, varas and meanders. Its history can be read in the deed records at the courthouse at Johnson City. The federal government has made an aerial map of it to show its boundaries and subdivisions. A cold topographical map which reduces the home place outlines and robs the land of its personality. Lines represent the miles of rock fences, mute stone autobiographies laid so well by Grandpa and his sons that they have clung together in mutual support, waiting on the next generations to come. Quarried from exposed limestone ledges or torn from the earth by crowbar, these rocks, once white, have turned lichen gray. But the home place is more than a house, more than a piece of ground on which cattle graze and taxes are paid. It is the place where the oral tradition of my family developed, where it is brought together by my father, where it is passed on to me. From this place, Grandpa and his brother, Judge, anti-slavery Southerners but admirers of Lincoln, went off to the Civil War, where they were shot honorably and returned with stories for generations to come. From this place, Buck and Bax Taylor, nephews to my grandmother, went off to join Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show and earn a share of fame and fortune. To this place, at the age of 16, came Jess Kennedy, my mother's cousin, a neighbor boy who had killed Ben Cage in self-defense, and here he stayed until the dark of noon when Uncle Sam slipped him through the fingers of the law, carried him to Bastrop horseback, and put him on a train to California. To this place came an old and wrinkled Mexican in search of Spanish treasure, and at this place, Papa turned basic plots such as these into stories that never lost their appeal. By the time I could remember, Papa was nearly blind. I suppose he never saw much better than James Thurber, and he saw a good deal like him, and talked a good deal as Thurber wrote. Papa was more than a teller of stories on the way into family tradition. Often, he was the unconscious hero of them. The center of a story about to enter the family oral tradition. Many of these stories center around his blindness. One, for example, is the story of Papa and Old Lee, our big pulled Durham bull. One day, in cotton season, Papa got back from the gin too late to unload the cottonseed. So he stopped his team under a live oak tree beside the cottonseed house, unhitched and fed them, and came on to the house for supper. Just as he finished eating, he remembered that he had left a 10-pound sack of sugar in the wagon. The night was black as a crow's wing, but out he went, saying he could see just about as well in the dark as in the daylight. And so could Old Lee, the bull. He had bed down under the tree, just about the end of the wagon tongue, and gone to sleep, to dream, perhaps of fresh cottonseed and heifers. The first time Papa knew of Lee, and Lee knew of him, was when Papa stumbled over Lee's rump and fell spread-eagled with his legs straddling something and his arms around Lee's neck. Lee awoke with a start, jumped to his feet with a frightened snort, and before Papa could say, "God damn," went crashing off through a cedar thicket across the road from the seed house. Papa left, roughly in a 90-degree angle from Lee's line of flight. His feet struck the lower limbs of the tree under which the wagon stood, and when he came down, his shoulders hit the wagon tongue. My memories of the home place are almost unlimited. It is a place where Grandma took her Ouija board off the mantle each morning at 10 o'clock and talked with her brother John, or Red Fox, the Indian chief, whose ectoplasm hung around somewhere out of sight, but was always present at 10. It was the place where the Booger Man lived in the old Big Mouth well until my Uncle Sam filled it with rocks and drove him out to some other unknown but dangerous abode. It is where the Christmas tree caught on fire in the west downstairs room and caused loud excitement amongst the women and children. It is where Grandpa waged relentless war against the red ants, decimating colony after colony and ant at a time by hitting them with a claw hammer as they came or went. It is the place where I came to in young manhood to milk and feed for Grandpa on cold winter evenings. It was the place of crackling hens and white eggs. It was the place where Papa was born and the place he came back to live 30 years to the day from the time he married my mother and moved into the log house where I was born. It is where I heard him die, where his rasping breath went out and faded into silence, and another never came in, where I waited until I knew it wouldn't, and then looked at the old Seth Thomas clock on the mantle and saw that it was 10 past 5 and growing dark outside. That's the way he went, from pain to peace. He had no fear of death so far as I could tell, loved the earth, was quite content to become part of it again. That's Papa and the home place. Now I'll turn to myself. The generation to which I was born was at the turning point between the old and the new, and I turned with it, sandwiched between the two. Perhaps you gain perspective if I say I remember how hoeing cotton was. The first part of the row, I looked back to see how far I'd come. The last to see how far I had to go. When the crowdgrass had got ahead of the hoe, or the tie vines bound to the seedling plants to the bulk, I moved as slow as necessity demanded. But when the row was clean, I set my paces in tune with my thoughts, and hardly knew time passed until something roused me from my reverie. I looked back from where I'd come and thought how pleasantly time had passed. That's what's happening now. For looking back, I mean, to where I started from too long ago. Looking back, I see how far I've come, and looking forward, I see there's not much left to hoe. That's not a morbid thought. Not many men have hoed a more pleasant row, and as for what's left, I look out on eternity as Papa did, without fear of becoming part of it. In the past dozen minutes and paragraphs, I have tried to demonstrate, through the example of my own home place, and my memories of it, a thesis that will apply to most home places, as you and I have known them. That is, I have tried to show that home place is an agriculturally based institution that grows out of a few acres settled under frontier conditions by a vigorous, semi-literate family that has moved westward by stages, bringing with it the vocabulary and speech patterns accumulated by its ancestors. That at about the halfway point between the advance on the frontier and the retreat to suburbia, the family proliferates into a special cluster dominated by a benevolent patriarch. That in this middle generation, some member with a love for storytelling will pull together the oral tradition of the family and tell it in the vernacular, and finally, that the oral tradition will dissipate and the home place will become a symbol to the generations that have retreated to suburbia.
Good job.
Thank you. Thank you.